All right, folks, we gave everyone a few minutes to fight through the infamous Peabody traffic, and so I think everyone who's going to be here is going to be here, and there's going to be a lot of people viewing this on video. We're being double taped here tonight, so that's, the more people who understand about Common Core, the better. I want to first thank some people who have come here. Two members of the Peabody School Committee, Beverly Dunn and Ed Charis, and I want to, of course, thank all the other members of the Peabody School Committee who are supporting and hosting this second in the Common Core series here, the informational evening. We also have a representative from Ted Spiliotis' office. Mike, thank you for being here. Ted had probably the only excuse that I would have accepted. It's his daughter's birthday and he's staying home with her, and who could blame him for that? But I do thank you, Mike, for coming in his place, and I know you're going to take some copious notes. Also, we have a contingency from the Hamilton Wyndham School Committee. Thank you for coming and learning a bit more about Common Core. And we also have our state rep, Leah Cole, there. She was here for our last meeting, our first in the series of Common Core as well. Thank you, Leah, for coming. And of course, the parents and many stakeholders here. Thank you so much for being here and learning all you can about this monumental change to public education. We are so fortunate to have with us Jim Stergios from the Pioneer Institute, and he travels all around the country speaking as an authority on this very topic. And I have some prepared remarks, so I'm going to, forgive me, I'm going to go to those for fear that I might not give him a sufficient introduction. The Pioneer Institute is an independent, nonpartisan, privately funded research organization founded in Boston in 1988. Pioneer's stated mission is to improve the quality of life in Massachusetts and beyond through civic discourse and data-driven public policy solutions based on free market principles, individual liberty and responsibility, and the ideal of effective, limited, and accountable government. In the 1990s, Pioneer was the leading champion of the state's landmark Education Reform Act. In 2006, Pioneer established the Center for School Reform, which promotes choice, competition, and high-quality academic curricula in the public school system. The Institute also focuses on high-quality, affordable health care containing the costs of Medicaid and other programs. The Institute also focuses on the effective state and local government issues. It's governed by a board of directors and run by Jim Stergios. Folks, would you please join me in giving a big hand for Jim Stergios.
Way too kind.
Jim, it's a delight to have you here this evening.
You violated the rule of all events, which is don't clap at the beginning, only clap at the end. Because you don't know what's coming.
Next time I'll know. But again, thank you for being here. I know that we're going to try to cover a lot of ground in the 90 minutes that we have with you. Why don't you perhaps, Jim, just kind of give us a brief overview of the genesis of Common Core, what's the Common Core 101, so to speak?
Sure, absolutely, and I appreciate the opportunity, and thank you again for being here. Thank you, folks from Hamilton. Thanks to parents for being here. It is always a pleasure to speak about Common Core with folks, because it's this is one of those unique issues where people have lots of questions. And frankly, I'm going to talk for a little while, and I'd rather have you guys ask specific things you're thinking about, you're hearing about. There's lots of misinformation, pro and con, on Common Core. Just help to get to facts. We often speak, I'm always amazed when I go to different states, and we were just recently in Tennessee, we had 850 people there for 4 hours, and they stayed. And there was probably 80% moms, and they were asking all kinds of questions like, what does it mean for math in the first grade? What does it mean for math in the fourth? I've got a fifth grade, And that already tells you something about the genesis of Common Core, which is that maybe the best way to do it is this. Let me tell you a little bit about Massachusetts for a second, and then let me tell you a story about the 1990s, and we'll get right into Common Core right after that, okay? Perfect. So, it's not often that Pioneer Institute, I get to sit in front of you and say, wow, I have a really good news story for you. Often when we're dealing with the MBTA, we say, whoa, what are you doing with the retirement fund? You guys aren't making it public. Or the Department of Children and Families, that story Pioneer broke and gave to the Boston Globe, that's not a happy story. Right? Our government sometimes fails us. Our government also sometimes serves us well. And education is one of those stories. If you go back to 1992, some of you may not have been in school age at that time. I certainly was past it. Massachusetts was 12th in the country on the national assessment, which is a sampled test. It's called the NAEP test, the National Assessment of Educational Progress. We were, in terms of the SATs, just a little north of the median in the country. That is a remarkable thing given our wealth, our educational attainments, given the institutions around us, and just how smart people are, right? I mean, it's amazing we're that bad, right? We're not Mississippi. And yet we were not killing it. We did not separate ourselves from the rest of the country. There is a lawsuit underway that asks this question. Wales, Massachusetts, there is such a place, has 63 kids in a classroom. How is that possible? How is that fair? When Brookline, Massachusetts, where my kids go to public schools, have 17, 18 kids in a classroom. And the court was about to decide, you've got to put a lot more money into education to make sure that every single district has a fair shot. Because in the 1780 Constitution, drafted by John Adams, it says that, and it's the only constitution that was drafted originally with language about education. It says, we will cherish the sciences and learning. It's a unique thing about Massachusetts. It tells you something about something that's in our water, right? But yet we were not living up to that. So the court case is about to be settled, and a boatload of money is going to have to be dumped in by taxpayers into education. And Bill Weld at the time, Billy Bulger at the time, who's the Senate president, and Mark Roosevelt, especially on the House side, and Tom Birmingham on the Senate side. Tom being a Chelsea kid, hard Scrabble plays. He was a Rhodes Scholar. They all sat together and said, what the heck are we going to do? We're not going to just pour more money into the system. We've seen what that's done elsewhere, and not much. So what we should do is this. And they battled over it for about a year. It's a complex bill, but it ends up being this. Yes, we will put more money into the system because places like Wales need to have some sort of equity, so you actually have, that's not workable, okay? So there's money that goes into the system from the state. Right now we spend about $4.5 billion a year from the state and about $4.5 billion from localities. The federal government provides a little less than $1 billion, about $800 million to Massachusetts. So the feds are paying about 8% of Massachusetts education. We, the taxpayers, state and local, are paying 92%. The second thing is we're going to set the highest academic standards, not skill standards, but academic standards. And what I mean by that specifically is it's driven by content. It's driven by liberal arts content, to be more specific. It's driven by literature and poetry, especially in the early grades, K through 8, and then slowly morphs into more and more nonfiction. And we'll talk about why that is. It's also as part of that, there was to be a test, which ended up being the MCAS test, a standardized test. It was never meant to be the perfect test. It is not a perfect test. It is a floor. It is a 10th grade attainment that kids get to try 5 times to get to.
And this was highly controversial, Jim, in its day, and there were meetings across the state. I'm actually been on the school committee so long. I was on it before the implementation of ed reform, and it was volatile. It was really volatile, and you'll remember all the battles in the late 1990s when there were buses of teachers who would go and protest in front of the State House saying, we don't want this, we don't want this. There was another important element to it, which was teacher certification. In Massachusetts is unique. Massachusetts doesn't use this teacher certification that every other state uses, which is called the PARCC test, which essentially tests teachers on pedagogy. Do you know how to teach in this method? Do you know how to establish self-esteem? There's a little bit on content. So if you're going to teach math, there's a little bit on math. Massachusetts test is completely different. It is based primarily on content, about 90% of it, and about 10% on pedagogy and other things. It is what has separated the wheat from the chaff, in great part. Mm-hmm. The final thing was charter schools, bulking up inter-district choice, and those sorts of things. So those are the elements of the law, and it has taken us from 12th in the country to number 1 in the country. 2005, we became number 1 in the country. We're the fastest improving state through 2007. After that, we've kind of flatlined. We've kind of pulled back on some of our reforms. If you want to talk about it later on, we're happy to talk about it. It's off topic. We test as a country in 2 different international tests. One is called the PISA test. Many of you will have heard about that.
The other test is called the TIMSS test, the Trends in Math and Science Study. The TIMSS test is the gold standard.
Right.
It's really based upon not just statistical manipulation, but actual content knowledge in mathematics, getting you ready for math, authentic level math in college. We are in the top 6 countries on those 2 tests. So it's a good news story, folks. I mean, you know, brighten up a little bit. You look all dour. It's a good news story, and it's a wonderful thing, and it's a wonderful thing to give to our kids. And is it being done everywhere? No. Boston and Lawrence and Springfield and all these other places that had failed in the past made lots of progress, but they started out so low that
Now,
it's not there yet.
and again, Jim, I want to point out, this was 1993 that the ed reform went into effect, and it was 2005 before we actually saw the ultimate results of all of that work and change.
That's absolutely right. 13 straight years of SAT improvement. Right? Just remarkable. At the same time, there's a little story maybe to tell you about the genesis of Common Core indirectly, if you will. Back under George H.W. Bush, there was a push to create national standards. It failed spectacularly. And then when Bill Clinton was elected president, many of the same people who were pushing that at the time, people like, there's a fellow named Mark Tucker who runs the National Center for Education and Economics, the Fordham Institute, Diane Ravitch, all these folks said, we really need to push forward with national standards because, you know, and this is before Massachusetts starts really driving up performance, and a number of other states also. Texas made a bunch of progress in the 1990s. California was making huge progress. They said, we've got really bad performance, and they're right. And some of the standards in the rest of the country were terrible, and they remain so. So they said, let's set national standards, and we'll come up with something internationally competitive. Mark Tucker has written a number of articles around this, and he's famous for a letter that's called the Dear Hillary letter, which is a 17-page letter, which essentially summarizes his big ideas in books and articles and all the rest. And he basically says, we need to have a centralized database in Washington, D.C., with all the states linking up their databases. We need to have workforce development-oriented standards, not academic standards, but things that are much more based upon getting kids into the workplace rather than getting them to college and doing academic work. It's a debate we can have. The data and the performance should be matched together in a way that the central government, through the states and localities, can advise kids on what kind of professions they should go into. Very much sort of, you know, his reinterpretation of a German model, okay?
Where the vocation is selected for you.
That's right,
Yeah.
Selected for you, and in fact, you make an early decision. And there are some, you know, my immediate reaction to that as a dad, and I've got 2 girls, and I've got a 6th grader right now. And if she had to decide by 8th grade what her path would be, that doesn't seem terribly American, simply because, I mean, she's kind of lazy. No, I didn't mean that.
Yeah, my youngest daughter's vocation was to be a doctor or a cheerleader. So that was.
No, me too. You know, I'm a math whiz, and they always said on those NEDT tests, you should do nuclear physics. And I wrote, I want to be a musician. Yeah, that's great.
You also want to eat.
That's right. So, I mean, that was the genesis back then. That fell flat on its face again. One of the reasons it fell flat on its face is that they started going after standards for U.S. history and social studies. One of the most politically fraught things you could do, where essentially you have to debate things like, is it the War of Northern Aggression or is it the Civil War? And you'll never get to settlement around that, right? So it died immediately, okay? None of these folks ever went away. Mark Tucker still was involved in the genesis of Common Core. Fordham Institute, Diane Ravitch, not so much. She's kind of going on a different path in terms of her thinking on education. But the very same players, the Council of Chief State School Officers, who are the state commissioners, essentially the bureaucrats that drive the state systems, are part of this. The National Governors Association has long been part of this effort. When you hear National Governors Association, you might think that means states are driving this.
I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the first things I hear, Jim, is that this is a state, Common Core is state-led, which gives someone who doesn't ask a lot of questions the impression that this is something that all the governors from all around the country got together in a room and looked at this and thoroughly explored it and signed off and said, yes, we we agree with this.
Yeah,
But
no,
is it state-led?
Let me tell you a little bit about a state-led process, and you tell me. And I'll just use Massachusetts because I know our example so well. It's that when we developed our standards, we started out in 1997. John Silber was the commissioner, was the chair of the Board of Ed, and John Silber, you might remember, was the president of Boston University. He's a mentor to me, so I can say this. He was a loudmouth. He had lots of warts. He made trouble every which way he went, but he was focused on one thing, and that is he was an intellectual who believed that every kid, like Tom Birmingham, and Tom Birmingham actually put him there. The Board of Education was in the early 1990s, after the passage of the law that I was talking about before, they were debating whether to put Ebonics in the classroom as part of our standards. The governor, Tom Birmingham, and Tom Finneran at the time said, no, this is not working out very well. Let's put John Silver in there and let's have him fix this. John put this debate about what kids should be taught on the front pages of our newspapers for years. Pushed very hard to make sure that we would have really high quality literary offerings and all the rest. So what we did as part of our process is Silber hired a woman named Sandy Stotsky. Many of you will be familiar with her. She's come to speak before you before. She is a gem. I mean, she's truly... Do you folks know the debate between phonics and whole language that's been going on for a long time? Mm-hmm. Sandy studied with a woman who blew up that entire thing, a woman named Jean Chall, who was the greatest expert on reading research, Harvard University professor in 1960s. Sandy was her sort of stepchild, right? Jean said, when I go, I want to have someone who can carry on the work of making sure kids can actually learn something. So Sandy was hired within the department to drive this process, and she brought together parents, teachers, respecting the role of teachers. She brought together scholars from our universities and business leaders. And they went through a process where they took their input, they developed a draft, they took public comment from it, they put it back out. This is what we're going to do in terms of revisions. They took more public comment back. It was debated in the front page news of the Boston Globe, the editorial pages here, everywhere. I mean, everyone was debating, what is this going to be? What is MCAS? If you go back then and you listen to the debates around math, how angry people get about math, you understand they really called the math wars for a reason. People were kind of berserk about whether constructivist math or this math or that math. This went on for years. English language arts took 2 years to develop. Math took about 3 years.
I don't mean to interrupt you,
Yeah, please.
but it went on for years in a public arena.
In a public
which is very,
arena.
very different from the genesis of Common Core, which went behind closed doors. Continue.
That's exactly right. It was so public that the math standards were developed after about 9 months. They looked at them, they said, this is terrible, and they fired the entire panel that was working on it. Yeah. All right, that's how public it was. So go a little bit forward to Common Core and the development of Common Core. One little footnote before, actually 2 footnotes before we get there, if you don't mind. 2005 to 2007, there's a national math panel that's set up by George W. Bush. They're the best math experts on it in the country. They look at 15,000 pieces of research, and they decide this is what, if states want to really improve their standards, this is what they have to do. Algebra 1 in the 8th grade, they have to do this kind of geometry, they have to do Algebra 2 really by no later than the 11th grade. They need to have some trigonometry, strong trigonometry, and some pre-calculus. That's kind of where they came out. That's footnote number 1. Footnote number 2. National Governors Association, one of the organizations that's for Common Core. Council of Chief State School Officers, the other one that's for Common Core.
And who's involved in that? Superintendents?
Those state superintendents or state commissioners.
Okay.
Only 5 months before Common Core's first draft standards, they came out with a report called Benchmarking for Success. And in it, they say, we need to have Algebra 1 in the 8th grade, all the things the National Math Panel says. So what happens with Common Core? And Dave, your point about not being public is absolutely true. Only 5 months after Benchmarking for Success, they come out with their first document. What happens in the interim? There are 3 lead writers on each side. David Coleman's one. The other one, he's on the English language arts side with Sue Pimentel, another person. Jason Zimba's a lead writer on the math side, working together with a fellow named Bill McCallum and another person as well.
And those folks had business ties as well. They weren't just educators. In fact, David Coleman doesn't have a degree in education.
Absolutely not. But you know, here's where My problem is they never had really any experience writing standards. Whether they had business interests or not, maybe they could be disinterested in the sense that our founders talked about being disinterested in politics. I don't want to prejudge that. But had they,
Leave that to me.
had they ever written standards that had driven performance improvements anywhere? No. Why would we hire these folks? And who hired them? Essentially, the Gates Foundation funded both the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association's lobbying arm. That's why the funding came to NGA through the Gates Foundation. It's the lobbying arm. Okay. And they drove this process of writing the standards behind closed doors. There was one website where the public could give public comment on one draft. They got 10,000 comments. It sounds like a lot, about 200 per state, right? When Massachusetts took comments, we had thousands and thousands just in Massachusetts, okay?
They would have maybe 2 teachers from a state.
I was in Indiana,
Yeah.
and I asked that exact question. When we go around, I always ask, how many teachers were, and I'll ask the state officials. And they were usually hand-picked people.
Yeah.
So when they developed these standards, what you had was a few commissioners sitting in at any one time with them. Not really any public comment, public input beyond one time through a website. There was never any, here's what we heard from the public, and here's how we're going to respond. There was never any of that. Legislators didn't know about it. It went through all the boards of education, with the exception of 2 states where it went through legislation as part of Race to the Top. And by January, they came out with their first standards. There were a number of different revisions thereafter. Their first standards actually ended in Algebra 1 in high school, by the way. They're supposed to be internationally benchmarked. There was no time for international benchmarking. There was no time to look at even the National Math Panel's studies. Right?
Well, they've backed
It was
away
done for
from
them.
the international benchmark position, have they not?
They have. I mean, that's from pressure from us where they say now they're internationally informed, which means they looked at a couple of standards and they said, hey, okay. What's really troubling is what comes after. And what comes after is this. The final standards are provided on June 2nd of 2010. States are given no more than 2 months to adopt, right, beginning of August. Think about what it means to write a 600-page application for the Race to the Top to get the funding in that kind of streamlined time frame. You make a lot of mistakes, you promise a lot of things. In just about every state that adopted Race to the Top, let me tell you something that's super troubling. Just to give you an example. The college presidents, the presidents of the state colleges and universities, in most of the states signed agreements saying that if a kid finishes a Common Core aligned curriculum in high school, he or she does not have to take remedial work at the university. What that means, the kid comes out with a weak Algebra 2 course and goes to a college, and you're telling me that kid does not need remedial math? They can't do it. So essentially what they're doing is not only dragging down the K-12 system, but the jewel of American prosperity, what has driven American prosperity, what has made up for failures for decades in our K-12 systems, will now be debilitated in part because you have to think 40 to 60% of kids coming out of college, depends on which subject you're talking about, take remedial courses. Magic wand, go away. It's remarkable. It's really remarkable. So that tells you how truncated, how concentrated that time period is, and the kinds of mistakes, errors you make for what. And maybe I could talk a little bit about cost at this point, what it means and that sort of thing, unless you want me to go into some of the things.
Yeah, I'm anxious to hear about the cost, but one of the things, I just kind of want to recap this. Massachusetts was number one. We had proven a couple of things. We had proven the way to do it, and I think, just as important, we have proven that a state can do this. This does not need to be a national program. Now, some people, when Race to the Top came out, a lot of people were referring to it around the country, particularly in those underperforming states, as this is the race to be Massachusetts. Right. And yet, Massachusetts, the Massachusetts model, which, by the way, would have cost those underperforming states $0 to adopt. It was done, it was proven, it was written. It always needs to evolve, as most things do. But it was ready to go. Did not cost the $4.4 billion of Race to the Top money. And I'll also tell you, and I'm proud to say this, that Peabody, when Race to the Top came to us in 2010, and a reminder, 2010, you think times are tough now? 2010, we were cutting classes, expanding class sizes, instituting parent fees, as I call them, athletic fees, transportation fees. It was the darkest time in the economy for schools. The state had no choice but to pull back a lot of their contributions to the schools. And here was someone waiving $100,000, $200,000, $300,000, just sign here and adopt these standards, and you're good to go. Now, we didn't see them. Did any states see them, Jim?
No.
No, so we signed up to get the money which we desperately needed to maintain reasonable class sizes and keep our public schools going. A lot of schools systems trusted their government and said, okay, the standards, that sounds innocuous enough. Yes, give us the money. I'm proud to say that Peabody voted that down. Not because we knew what we were saying no to, but we just couldn't believe that the government was going to give us that kind of money, and as desperately as we needed it. We couldn't believe they were going to give it to us without strings attached, because we'd been down that road too many times before with unfunded mandates. I know I'm stealing a lot of your thunder, but hopefully this is a segue, Jim, into, and then I want to come back to David Coleman if I can, into the cost. It will astonish you to know that the implementation of Common Core, there has been no real cost study done by the proponents of Common Core. The Pioneer Institute has done the most research on what the potential costs are, and I'm glad you're all sitting down.
Well, you know, when you're talking about how you were not able to see what they were asking you to approve, I mean, think about this for a second. In the January 2010 initial application, draft application by the state to the United States Department of Education, if you look in the language, they actually made a commitment by 2014, 2015, that academic year that's coming up next year, to replace the MCAS with the PARCC test. The test it still isn't done. No. So there's a lot of sort of sight unseen, oh, there's money over here, let's go after it stuff. It's just sort of the way that the world seems to work in education policy right now.
And yet the proponents would have you believe that this was all done willingly, knowingly, full knowledge and compliance, and nothing could be further from the truth.
There's no way, I mean, again, go back to Massachusetts developing its own standards and going through the public process of debating them. It took years to do that, and yet for the Race to Top money, in 2 months they were able to vet everything. It's just remarkable, and that's why, and it was in the summer and people weren't around, and okay, anyways. Let me talk to you a little bit about what it means. We all spend money, and we all believe, I think, that spending money in education is a good thing.
Yes.
Right? If we're going to spend it, let's spend it there, right? It's a multiplier that you don't get in other aspects, other features of government or society. So, you know, we spend about $9 billion a year here in Massachusetts on education, $9.5 billion a year. Race to the Top was about $250 million. Race to the Top had many different components. About $80 million is associated with Common Core for Massachusetts, right? Implementation with our professional development textbooks, some level of technology purchasing and that sort of thing. So $80 million, we were the first, and Dave, you're absolutely right, when we looked at this in 2011, no one knew what it cost to develop, to implement Common Core. And it's just a remarkable thing, a policy that could affect 50 million kids in the United States. No one at the federal level, anywhere, had done real analysis to understand what's going to cost everybody. We said, let's do that. So we hired an assessment guru from the United States Department of Education formally, so had not a jaundiced view of federal involvement, that sort of thing. And someone who had worked many times with the Gates Foundation, even. And what we did is we asked him, could you just tell us what the professional done, the textbooks, the technology, what will it cost us? And do it state by state, and look at empirical evidence. Don't do it on a sort of, let's hope it could come out this way. What he came up with was about $17 billion for the country, about $355 million for Massachusetts. And what we're finding is that he was wrong. He was way, way, way too low. The Commissioner of Education in Florida, Tony Bennett, was essentially fired over this issue. Their technology costs came in $400 million above. California passed a $6 billion tax hike About $1 billion of that's going to California's effort on Common Core. There's just a lot of money that needs to go, especially into the technology side. And here in Massachusetts, there's been noise made by the Commissioner of Education to try and use some of the school building assistance funding as a capital account to fund the purchase of technology.
And the technology, Jim, is to accommodate the test.
Absolutely. And so these things here, every single kid's gonna have to be on one of those things. Tablet may not work, which tablets are a little bit cheaper. The tests, PARCC tests, are going to be almost exclusively, if not exclusively, except in the case of special needs students, on computers.
Now, when we think about technology in the schools, we kind of think, well, that means that the technology is there to bring things to the student, right? But in this use, the technology is to take things from the student into a database for data collection.
That's right. That's right. And we just are coming out with a report on the data collection issue this week, probably released on Thursday.
I look forward to seeing that.
And what we're trying to do is separate fact from fiction. There's been a lot of sort of craziness out there in terms of talking about, the federal government wants to attach brainwave scanners to you and that sort of thing. And the truth is the federal government did pay for, I should say the Gates Foundation, a couple other foundations paid for a study that was done by the United States Department of Education looking into that. But it's not something that's part of Common Core, right? And one of the things we want to do is, we got a Harvard-trained lawyer and a couple of other people who know this issue well to work together on a paper and say, let's just separate what's true, what's not true. Because our view is facts set you free, and if you're talking baloney, you lose the argument. So let's talk reality here. So on the data side, just to, not to alarm you, but we're swimming in data already. There is a data warehouse that the Massachusetts Department of Education has. They don't even know what to do with the majority of their data. They collect, if they're part of the NCES system, which I believe they are, I'd have to check on that. I should know that, but I don't recall that. There's a collection of about 400 plus data points on kids. Most of it's innocuous stuff. It's directory type stuff, name, last name, address, all that sort of stuff. Here's what the problems are. When you start connecting up the databases and some of what's in those databases is a little bit too personal. Things like marital status, perhaps parents don't want that out there. Things like health outcomes. There's all kinds of stuff that's in those databases. The problem with it is, if you are sucking out information from the school through the computers on kids in terms of performance, and you're matching it up with what could be student identifiable data, student identifiers. It can be ultimately given to private firms, given what's happened to federal law. And let me explain what I mean by that. There's something called FERPA law. FERPA law is to protect, it's been around for 25 years, it's to protect us from having our personal information out there, especially if it's identifiable. And FERPA law for the longest time said that agencies like the United States Department of Education, if they had personally identifiable data, they would have to scratch that stuff out, and they could only give it to an authorized responsible agent, which was defined as somebody who worked for the department. Through a regulatory change did not go before Congress, even though that was longstanding law. They changed that. So they could actually give it to a private firm that is on contract with them. You may have heard about InBloom, which is a company that seems to be getting close to going belly up because no one wants to have anything to do with them because of this issue that parents are really worried about it. But not just them. It could be give it to a university, right? Universities doing analyses. I'm not sure that parents have signed up for that. I'm not sure they believe that they should not have an ability to opt out of that sort of thing. And our view is they absolutely need to be. So we can get into more and more on that, but the good news is brain scanners are not coming your way. The bad news is that we are swimming in data, and because of all the agreements that were signed during Race to the Top, one of the agreements was that states would have to create communicating, similarly structured databases in order to provide data sets to the federal government that they could actually use. The reason they did that is because federal law prohibits them from creating a single database, a federal database. So getting the states to do it through incentives. That's taking that in the FERPA law into consideration. It is something that is deeply troubling. and the opt-out strategies for parents really are not there. And one of the things we all have to think about is whether we advance legislation that really strengthens opt-out opportunities for parents in a very clear way. So at the start of the year, I want to opt out of all that if you want to. You need to be able to control, parents should be able to control whatever is known about their children, I believe.
I just want to follow up on in Bloom because our school committee had discussed that very issue. Massachusetts was one of, I think, 11 states that agreed to share data with this In Bloom. In Bloom was a company that started about 18 months ago, funded in $100 million by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They keep funding everything in the back end of the Common Core. Bill and Melinda Gates do a lot of good with their money, so I want to make that clear. In this instance, they are really funding a lot of this. In Bloom, one of the states that they agreed to collect the data on was Louisiana. Louisiana found out that they were taking data that they should not be taking, such as Social Security numbers from the students, and they threw them out. New York State, a state very similar demographically and otherwise to Massachusetts, with also a governor who's very strong proponent of Common Core. There was such backlash against In Bloom that his own handpicked panel that was put together to help with the implementation of Common Core, one of their top 7 recommendations was get rid of In Bloom. The point is, in my mind, Jim, is that data collection might be fine, but in the wrong hands it can be potentially dangerous. So you're taking a lot of chances, and anytime someone tells you that data is going to be secure, I always think to myself, the NSA, what data was more secure than the NSA data? And we saw how that has been changed. One other quick note on data. There's a company called WhatsApp, and maybe some of you are familiar with that app. I use it myself. If you're traveling abroad, you can text message at no charge. Very helpful. 55 employees, the company's 2 years old. Facebook bought them for $15.5 billion. $billion. They had no real assets, right? They had no big buildings, not a lot of material. $15.5 billion, but what they did have was data. They had data on people. So now that we're sharing, now that we've adjusted our FERPA laws to accommodate Common Core and third parties, right? What do you suppose the data on every child in a classroom in America, what do you suppose that data might be worth? Mm-hmm. Just throw it out there.
No, I completely agree. And I guess for think about Google. Google's had a lot of problems recently on this issue. Now it's had to make commitments to districts, several of them here in Massachusetts, that they would not be using student data in any way over the next undefined term. But they said, for now, we're not going to be doing that. So they're feeling the pinch as well. And I know just a couple things I just want to make clear for Representative Cole and also for you and Rep. Spilios's office. Just to underscore that we got about $80 million to implement Common Core, and we're going to spend $355 million. That is stuff you guys have to deal with. It's $275 million, and it's probably going to be more than that, because again, we were undervaluing the actual cost. I'd also say, just look, in terms of the security of data, you remember TJ Maxx,
yep.
And there are lots of banks who have a great interest in maintaining their data, because if TJ Maxx loses its data, they lose their customers for a long time, and yet they cannot keep it going.
From a 17-year-old kid in Russia living in his mother's basement. Listen, I want to get back to you, if I may.
Yep.
This is fascinating to you. Just when you think you have a pretty good handle on this, you bring new information in. I want to get back to David Coleman. When I started doing research on this, his name just kept popping up. And he started a company after he graduated from Oxford, brilliant mind, unquestionably. He started a company with Jason
Zimba,
a very strong mathematic background, unquestionably, bright guys. And they started a company that helped with report card assessment. Started it up in New York, and their first big account that they landed was a $2.2 million contract for the Chicago school systems. And the Chicago school systems, it was funded by, was the Annenberg Foundation. And they had a community activist kind of overseeing that, and the community activist's name was Barack Obama. So Barack Obama helped assist in this presumably good cause, and they went to the chief executive, the chief finance person, I guess akin to a business manager, but on a bigger scale in a big city like Chicago, and that person was Arnie Duncan. Arnie Duncan is now the Secretary of Education for the United States. And so the implementation, I guess, went well enough that David Coleman was able to sell his $2.5 million contract in Chicago to McGraw-Hill for rumored to be $15.5 million. Some say it was only $14 million, but he made a nice chunk of change. David Coleman then gets involved with, as you mentioned, being what most people would say is the chief architect of the Common Core standards. David Coleman moved on after he had written those, and he now has a new job. He's the president of the College Board. The College Board, if you don't know, they're the ones who are responsible for the SATs. And about 6 months, maybe 8 months ago, the SATs David Coleman made an announcement. The SAT standards were going to be changed. And by every measure, and correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, by every measure, the new standards are to be perfectly changed to accommodate the lower standards of Common Core. And if I don't have that right, Jim, please let me know.
Well, I think you have that all right, and I would say this is, it's been remarkable to me to see, and I know David Coleman, I think well of him. I think he's got 15,000 ideas a minute, and I'm not sure that many of them are that practical. But it has been remarkable to see his rise through all of these different positions. But along the way, he's left a trail of comments about what he thinks and how he thinks, and I think it's helpful for us to actually understand Common Core if we go back and look at some of those. At Student Achievement Partners, another company that he started after the GROW Network, he started working on curricular materials for students, and a lot of it tells you his view of what academic work is like. So, to give you an example, Student Achievement Partners takes a look at the Gettysburg Address and how to teach it. And their view of it is, we should not teach any background, any sort of historical context for the Gettysburg Address, because if we do that, it puts some students at an unfair disadvantage. So no longer are we trying to create virtuous cycles where everyone wants to learn more and more and more, but we're lowering to the most common denominator. That is not specifically in the Common Core standards, right? So just full disclosure. But I think all these different pieces that you learn about David tell you something about how they thought about the English language arts standards. And maybe I could tell you a little bit about how that translates into the quality of what they're purporting to advance on that side, and maybe a little on the math, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
Means, yeah.
Okay. So let's just start with the English language arts standards. Again, Common Core is two things: English language arts standards and math standards. That's it so far. They do want to create science standards, and they do want to create U.S. history / social studies standards. There are some drafts out there, early drafts, but they're not anywhere towards getting implemented. So start with the English language arts side. And maybe the best place to start is what I was saying about Massachusetts standards. So Sandy Stolsky sets up our standards, and K through 8, they're largely literature and poetry driven, not because she's a softie or the reading research is extremely clear that if you study literature, high quality literature and poetry in the early grades, your vocabulary is deeper and broader, faster. And that's really important if you want to get kids to third grade reading level, because if you can get them to third grade reading level with the right kind of vocabulary, the rest of their lives will be a hell of a lot easier. It just the way that what you do with reading in fourth grade means you have to know a lot more in the third grade about how to just do some basic reading. Because in the fourth, manipulating texts, doing much more in terms of summaries, restating. If you can't read and do that sort of stuff by the third grade, at least to understand the text, you're in deep trouble. So let's take a look at the Common Core standards. What do? They say, well, let's not focus on literature and poetry. Let's focus about 50-50, some literature and poetry, and let's do some nonfiction. Let's do extracts from on science, some extracts from magazines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The problem with that is this. Again, it's sort of the lowest common denominator. Can we get people to digest stuff? Maybe you could get there if you have them learn the vocabulary for a nonfiction text. But the beauty of learning literary work early in your your academic life, is that you learn nuance and irony. You understand the family resemblances of words. You understand that a sanction can mean one thing in one context and a completely different thing in another context, as President Obama may understand about sanctioning the Russians. You learn the ability to actually be critical in your thinking. You also understand whether someone could be lying in a context. You question things. What are they doing there? That doesn't happen in a nonfiction text. Right? So again, we're going back to that lowest common denominator, not asking people to really dig in deep and pull things apart, but let's get everyone to a level playing field. That's not the way to drive achievement. The way to drive achievement is to really reach for the stars and say we will aim really high. And some kids will not get there, and we will catch them up the best that we can. But for all kids, we have to reach as high as they can get. That's why you want to make sure you do have pre-calculus on the math side. That's why you do want to make sure that the writing standards that come with your reading standards are aiming to get you to the place where you can actually maybe do a term paper by the time you're in the 12th grade, right? Let me go a little bit to talk to you a little bit about the math side. Maybe the best thing to do is I'll give you the end of the story on math, and then I'll tell you the beginning of the story. So the end of the story is, and I mentioned it before, Common Core tops out with Algebra 2. That's it. It has an experimental approach to geometry just before that Algebra 2 course, which is a weak course again. That experimental approach was used in the 1970s in the Soviet Union. I am not raising the Soviet flag as, oh, the communists, not that at all, folks. The Russians are awesome at math. I respect them deeply. But it's been tested in Western Europe and in North America many times. It has never been successfully used. This is an experiment on 45 million kids, all right? What else is there? Algebra 1 moves to 9th and 10th grade. It's behind our 8th grade, which we go after. You take a look at the way they teach fractions in the early grades, it's a mess. 3 of the early grades insist upon constructivist math. You're not going to use a standard algorithm. You're going to use 4 different methods to solve that problem. And you're going to write how you do it. It is a bloody mess and frankly unteachable in some regards. And let me give you a very specific example of what I mean. I'm going to read to you a first grade standard.
We need a calculus.
You do not.
Good.
But you need to do something to make your head not spin. So please put on something. Let me start by saying the first grade math standards have a number of standards. All right? It's not just one standard. This is only one of many. Okay, but let me read it to you. So this standard is for adding within 100. Okay? Add within 100 using a 2-digit number and a 1-digit number. That's good. Add within 100, adding a 2-digit number with a multiple of 10. That's awesome. That's good. That's what belongs in those standards. Add within 100 using concrete models or drawing and strategies based on place value, properties of operations, and or the relationship between addition and subtraction.
What grade is
This is first grade. No, there's more. There's more. You could, with a stretch and a teacher who knows how to articulate that last one, you might be able to get there. You might. But let's go to the next one. Add within 100 and relate the strategy to a written method and explain the reasoning used. That's in a first grade standard. This is not a 5th grade standard where kids know how to actually write at this point. They're searching for motor skills in math. They're searching for some basic understanding. And you wonder why Louis C.K. comes out and says, it's driving my kids crazy. I'm not saying Louis C.K. is my favorite, but hey. There's more, by the way, in that one. This is one standard. Add within 100 and understand that in adding 2-digit numbers, one adds 10s and 10s, 1s and 1s, and sometimes it is necessary to compose a 10. Now we're done. Let me tell you, folks, that is one of several standards in first grade. The first 3 elements I talked about, using a 2-digit number and a 1-digit number, using a 2-digit number with a multiple of 10, and using the concrete models is already getting us into constructivist math. But doing something like that would take up 70 to 80% of the time in a high-performing country. And yet, they pile in more. And then there are different standards on top of that. This is like smorgasbord kind of learning, where Common Core was sold as being fewer, deeper standards. This is more. This is the product of having a rushed, standardized development of the standards, very few months, closed doors, people sitting around with their own interests who are essentially compromising, saying you get your piece of the standards and I'll get mine in, and that's why there's so much in there. And you see this throughout the early grades, where there are semicolons all over the place to make sure that there's not a period at the end saying, that's the end of the standard. It's craziness. This is not how you do standards. It's not coherent, and frankly, it is not teachable for a teacher in the classroom. It is not fair to the teacher, okay? So the end is bad, and the beginning's at least as bad.
Jim, that's unbelievable, and thank you. That certainly brings the point home. We haven't even gotten into the fact that the PARCC test is going to be used for the teacher's assessment. That takes nothing into consideration that in Peabody has happened sometimes. A dozen homeless kids might move into one of the local hotels, and those might be the kids that are taking the PARCC test that next day, and the various backgrounds that these kids might have. But the teacher's evaluation is going to be based on the results of that PARCC test. Their very careers are going to be based on that. Suffice to say, education is best served at the local level. The teachers know the students, the school committees know their teachers and their superintendents, and so on. I did promise you that we're going to have some time for questions, and even though there's so much more to talk about. Jim, before we go to questions, did you want to make any?
No, I frankly would love to take questions and answer whatever you guys, I think we've gone long enough.
What I'm going to do is, and I've learned this when we had Sandra here, some of the brightest statements that were made were from the questioners, and no one really got to hear it because we didn't have a microphone. If you have a question, would you please come up here? And Jim, you can stand up too. I know you like to walk around. It's up to you. Are you really comfortable?
Okay.
Any questions? Here comes a brave soul. The first person is always. Oh, you're leaving. Thanks for being here. All right. Well, until we get some people. Oh, please come down.
Hi, I just have a follow-up. I'm Sheila McDonald from Hamilton Wenham. You talked about the Gettysburg Address with no historical background.
Yep.
And that some kids would be at a disadvantage. And could you elaborate on that?
Yep. So the thought is, if you know the reference points for the Gettysburg Address in terms of location, why Lincoln decided to go there, what was going on at the time, this little thing called the Civil War and all the rest, that one, you would import that into your reading, but two, it might put other kids at a disadvantage were they not to know what the Civil War is. And that's not a joke, folks. A lot of kids have no idea what the Civil War is. They don't know what the time of it was and all the rest. So the thought was to put everyone on a level playing field, let's ignore all that and let's just read the text for grammar, for expression, and all the rest. The problem with that is it's really hard for a kid to, one, get interested in a text unless that, you're not a philologist or something when you're, just studying, etymology of the words. And I get, you're there to read for a reason. And what drives kids to read and be interested in reading is narrative. It's understanding a character and what's at play, what's at stake. And there's none of that. There's none of that. So that's the philosophy. That's not in Common Core. I want to be complete with you folks.
Okay, that was easy. Quick question, watch your step. All right, if anyone else has a question.
There's been some question about a moniker known as one-to-one, which basically has to do with devices in the Hamilton area. They're talking about iPads. I know. Is there any connection between this ratio of one-to-one and the PARCC testing?
Absolutely. Absolutely there is. I mean, look, you're going to see a lot of this discussion. I'm sure in Hamilton, like in my hometown, I sit on an override study committee, and part of the override is due to enrollment growth, but part of it's due to the fact that there's a huge technology plan that folks want to advance. Why do they want to advance this technology plan? Because they want to have quote-unquote equity. That's sort of the buzz term, that all kids will have access to a device. The fact is you need that for Common Core, right? And as they make decisions about what to buy, they're going to think about how many kids are going to get tested at one time, how many computers do we need. They're going to have to be computers of a certain kind. In the short term, they may allow a tablet, even though it's imperfect given what the kids have to go through during that test. It's all online for a while. Sitting at a computer monitor is a much easier thing with a keyboard. They're much more used to it. But that is absolutely driving it. And that's what I mean by when you think about the cost of Common Core, they're trying to find end runs around it by going to the school building assistance program, which And just seeing, they're having conversations, I don't want to blow it out of proportion, but they're trying to see, can we borrow money that we would use to replace windows or renovate a place, and let's put it into computers because we need it for Common Core. But you're also seeing a lot of local actions being taken because districts know that the hammer's going to come down, people want them to implement next year, right? And if kids don't have the ability to take the test, they're at a disadvantage. So it is driving a lot of technology purchases. And is driving that one-to-one conversation. I can tell you they'll probably settle for a lot less than one-to-one. Have that conversation around bring your own devices, they'll cave on some of it. But that is driving a big piece of this.
Good question, Charlie. Yes, please.
Oh gosh, I feel like I could talk to you all night.
You can.
I want to with Peabody. My name is Pam, and I'm a parent, but I also work as an occupational therapist in public school systems.
Yep.
And some of my concerns are related to professionally and personally. When you're saying like they need a computer for the PARCC system, I know it's MCAS week this week, and they're in every nook and cranny trying to meet the accommodations of the kids that need to be alone, that need a quiet time.
Yep.
How is that even logistically going to be possible to accommodate those children, and are they going to be shoved in situations that are going to set them up for failure?
It's a great question, and I have a really disappointing answer for you, which is they have no idea. They have no idea. I mean, this has been debated back and forth, PARCC and SBAC, the two consortia that are developing the tests, are trying to think this through. The Commissioner of Education is trying to think this thing through. They've made no public announcements whatsoever about it. And frankly, when I think about it, I don't know. I have no idea. My guess is that they're going to have to find some way to ensure that some kids who need accommodations will take the test the same way they've taken the MCAS. And they'll grandfather that in for a few years. And that will mean paper tests. And then someone will have to manually input it and all that sort of stuff. But I think that's the only way they can deal with it. The thing is, though, I think it's, given that we have about 16% of our kids have special needs in Massachusetts, given the fact that I believe it is almost 5% of the kids get accommodations overall in terms of the National Assessment Sample Test, I would expect they probably have almost the same rate, if not a little bit higher, for the PARCC test. They'll probably be between the two, be a hybrid. That's a lot of kids.
Yeah.
It's a lot of kids, a lot of inputting, and I don't know how it's going to be worked.
And then my other question, sorry, is just really related to, as a parent, that whole central data, even MCAS frustrates me tremendously, because even when I get the data, I don't know, I should know this, but I don't, when the schools get the data, but I know even as a parent, like my son failed several times. I got it the whole beginning of the next academic year, and I'm like, oh, isn't that helpful?
Yeah.
What the heck do I do now? That was last year, in March or May, and I'm finding out in like October as a parent, and I'm just concerned with the PARCC, the same thing, that central data. I don't feel like personally or professionally, like how do we stop it? Because it doesn't do anything to help the student. I feel like it does nothing for the students. Am I wrong to feel that?
No, you're not wrong to feel. One of the great weaknesses of MCAS throughout time has been that it's given part of the way through the year. It doesn't really even reflect a full year's work. And then you get it, September the next year. So what do you do over the summer with your kid to make sure you can actually remediate your own child or help your own child to grow and catch up, right?
Right.
So pretty unhelpful. I completely agree on that. Folks, we collect so much data, and it's always an excuse to not do the hard things we need to do. To really drive change in the school, you probably need something between 10 and 20 data points. And those are largely, test scores, behavior, a few other metrics, but you don't need the gobs of data that we're actually collecting on kids. This idea that technocratically we're going to find the scientific way to teach kids is baloney. Kids in Massachusetts actually probably learn somewhat differently from kids in other places in terms of literature because of what they're used to. To say that kids in Mississippi should do exactly the same kind of math as the kids in Massachusetts is setting up for incredible failure. We're dealing with human beings here, and we're dealing with generations, and generations, hopefully over time, we bring them up. We haven't been doing it recently. So I share your concerns on the data points. I think it's completely exaggerated. They actually want to get at the use of computers, what kids are reading, how they react to specific test questions and stuff like that. It is a little troubling. And it gets back to something Dave said before, which is control. Where should control lie? I don't say this in an ideological way. Local control really matters. I get aggravated as heck sometimes by local control, okay? I want to see change faster. But you know what? There's public process for a reason. And that is, you have to bring people along and convince them of stuff, and you have to get their input, and they have to feel respect and all the rest. On the data question, and on education policy generally, think of it this way. There's something in political science called subsidiarity theory, which is essentially saying those people who have most at stake should be the ones holding people accountable. Pretty simple, right? My kids in the school, I live in the district, the performance of the schools impacts my real estate values, I should have a big voice. What we're doing with all this is centralizing it to the place where, as I mentioned before, the feds are providing 8 to 10% of funding. And we're going to give up huge levers of power to them to determine how data is collected, what kids study. That seems really counterintuitive to me.
Lastly, where, as a parent, if I really want to work on that opting out. I have one child that's older, going into high school. He's already been going through the MCAS process, but my youngest doesn't have to be faced with this as of yet because he's so young. What do you recommend the best method or place or organization or something to go to begin to fight this, I guess?
I think you have many of the people in the room, whether Dave or Beverly or the folks who on the school committee. You need to talk to them. You need to talk to Leah. You need to talk to Representative Spiliotis. We should have legislation that says very clearly when parents can opt out and let them opt out. Other states have done this. Florida advanced a bill that's pretty strong to protect the rights of parents. I mean, parents, your relationship with your kids is sacred one. You need to protect them. That's kind of what we feel with our kids, right? The federal government doesn't feel that the same way. A bureaucrat doesn't feel the same way. So you need to be able to trump them, I believe. And that means a piece of legislation, that's state legislation, that makes very clear what your rights are. And frankly, again, I think it's really important. It allows you in one fell swoop, not every single time you're looking at data, not 17 times during the year, oops, you missed one. You get to express one time a year, September, I'm in, I'm out. And that's a legislative question, frankly. And I would urge folks to think about that. That's an important one for the parents in the district.
I will tell you that Peabody School Committee voted unanimously to allow parents to opt out. And in terms of what Jim was saying about the resources, there's some literature on your chairs. There's lots of information about Common Core out there on the internet, but because it's the internet, there's some junk. And I would recommend you steer you towards this group because it's almost like a consortium of multiple groups. There's very credible information there, and you'll learn a lot. And I will tell you, even if you're an expert on Common Core today, tomorrow there's more things happening every day. And I will also add, because I'm an optimist too, Jim, as you are, in spite of this issue that we're facing that's so well financed and so entrenched, and there's so much to be gained by the people who are pushing this down our throat. Every single day, I run into more people who at least have heard of Common Core. They know it's controversial. They don't know any of the details, but now when I talk to, I'd say half the people I talk to when I mention Common Core, yeah, I've heard of it. What is that all about? And that's where it has to start. Tonight's is all about education of Common Core. I honestly don't care if you look at the issue and you like Common Core, God bless you. You've taken the time to learn about the most monumental change to public education in our lifetime. What really bothers me, and I can't abide, is 99% of the people don't know about it, and it's coming at them like a train. All right, so this is for some of you the first step, and for others of you this is the accelerated course. Well, I could go on, but I'd rather hear it from you.
Hi, I'm Elaine Apple from Hamilton, Wenham School District. Our district is a high-performing district, and not the top of the state, but near the top. And our school committee and our superintendent and principals have said that they feel that we are slipping a little bit in the last few years. And they have some data, some test scores that show that. And it seems to me that a lot of some changes that are being proposed seem to be very focused on fixing that and keeping us up to where we think we should be, which we have no reason to not continue to be at the top of the state. And I get very confused when some of these fixes seem to be about all tied in with curriculum, and we know that the curriculum is changing, and we're focusing on bringing in new curriculum. And I guess my question is how, if we're reorganizing the district, bringing in administrators to evaluate teachers and tying curriculum is being the public statement, and whereas the private statement is that we're just trying to improve our test scores, I am really having a hard time piecing all that together. Do you have any insight on how districts are improving pre-existing problems while facing the onslaught of the changes that Common Core brings? I don't know if I'm clear.
The way I put it is that how are districts actually dealing with some of their existing problems while trying to take on Common Core at the same time?
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Thank you.
No,
It's long-winded, but yes.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Let me start with a couple things you said at the beginning because they struck me as important. First, you said that they feel that we are slipping. Something you guys should all know, I give you a real happy talk about, I'm going to end with something really hopeful, by the way, later on, but so let me go into something a little bit depressing. I mentioned how well Massachusetts was started doing after 1995 through 2005, and how we rose to #1 in the country, in the top 6 countries. What you're seeing in terms of slippage is what we see across Massachusetts, in the early grades especially. 3rd grade and 4th grade reading scores over the last 3 years have stagnated and then gone down 2 consecutive years. Policy changes tend to affect youngest kids first because they haven't been in the system very long. So if you will, the proportion of time that's been spent with the new policies is larger than kids, let's say, in the 10th grade, who've already gone through previous policy, right? This is troubling to us. I mean, I can't say there's a causal link. What I can say is that's troubling data. It's not 1 year, it's 3 years. So when you see slippage, I see slippage. Part of this is not related to Common Core. Part of it potentially is. We started implementing Common Core really in earnest in 2011, so it could be filtering down by then. But some things were happening before Common Core under the administration where they decided that we would weaken some of our focus on academics, then move toward more of a skills basis. And that started in 2008. They also got rid of the accountability office, which would go in and do, if you will, MRIs in all the districts and say, how are you doing this? Are you aligned with the state standards? How are you doing? Are you doing your teacher evaluation, all that? And they were of some utility. I don't know what you thought of them, Dave, but they were of some utility, I think, in kind of keeping people's toes, you had to keep moving and keep moving ahead. I think a lot of districts actually feel a little bit lazy these days, to be quite honest with you. I live in a district that I feel has gone completely lazy. I'm glad this is taped. I hope he sees it.
It's only going to be seen by about 20,000 people. Don't worry about it.
Send it to Brookline. So as far as the changes that are being proposed to deal with it, one of the proposed changes that you mentioned is teacher evaluations. There's a lot of activity going into it. And frankly, I'd appreciate your view on this, Steve. I'd appreciate your view, folks from Hamilton, from the school committee, if you guys want to apply on this. My view of the teacher evaluations is not charitable. It is a pretty bureaucratic, top-down way of evaluating folks that is in part defined by what the feds wanted. It has, I believe, 16 different components. Little of it is actually related to student achievement. And frankly, I'm not sure how good what it's going to do besides have people run around and fill out a lot of forms. So there's a lot of that they're trying to keep up with. I'm not sure that's fixing the problem because it seems to me it's sort of make work. Right? So we see all the districts kind of running around doing that, and I'm not sure they're actually dealing with the existing problems there. I think, to be quite honest, the existing problems that we have in our district are pretty simple. One is, how do you retain really high-quality teachers? I mean, we know 2 things about education. It's really all we know. That parental involvement matters a ton, and the quality of your teacher, and that also includes the quality of the content the teacher's teaching, matters, right? So what are we doing to retain really high-quality teachers? How are we actually understanding who is high-quality? That teacher evaluation is not doing it in my mind. And so my answer to you on this is in terms of how our district's dealing with existing problems, I don't think they are. I think we've created a lot of make work that's not getting us anywhere. And unfortunately, and this is not a political statement, folks, I don't mean it as a political statement, but since Tom Birmingham, who was the Democratic senator from Chelsea, left office, there's not been any leadership in the Senate, and we are looking for leaders in the House who feel deeply in their hearts that education is, their calling. We need leadership on the Hill.
Oh, Jim, that's a perfect segue, because I wanted to recognize Senator Joan Lovely, who just came in. Joan was here for our early presentation by Sandra Stotsky.
So I apologize for my statement.
Not at all. Here's the exception that will give you hope. Joan is actually is a co-sponsor of legislation by Kiko Oral, who basically is saying, folks, until we know what the cost of Common Core is, we better take a pause, hit the pause button, and thank you for your support of that. I don't care what side of the fence you fall on this issue. I think any reasonable person would say, I don't know what it's going to cost, and until I do, I'm not buying. I think that's more than reasonable. Another thing, just to show you to the point about evaluation, just to show you how not ready for prime time PARCC is. This will astonish you to know this. I almost fainted. I actually went on Snoops, the site, to check if something is real or not, and indeed it was. The essay portion of your PARCC test, right? That's not something that you can run through a machine and just get like a bubble test. The essay, a human has to look at the essay portion of that test. Obviously, the essay is going to rate the child's performance and how well the teacher did, right? That evaluation is going to affect that teacher's career. The essay is Pearson had an advertisement in hiring people who were going to evaluate the essay, right? $15 an hour, advertised on Craigslist for a temporary worker, right? No degree in education required. How is that? Are you kidding me? I'm sorry, I could go. There must be someone else out there with, Beverly, and then we'll get to you. Okay, always the lady.
Hi, Deb from Hamilton. I just have a question about organizational structure, and forgive me if I should know this, but I like to try and put things into a context and then follow the money. And people are usually act based on behaviors and metrics upon which they're going to be judged, and that becomes their motivating factor. I'm glad that's you, not me. That's the same, right? So I'm just wondering, you made a comment that there are a few people in Massachusetts who approved it, the Race to the Top funds, and signed off. So I'm curious who those people are. And then I'm curious about the structure within Massachusetts that dictates down to the local level what the metrics are that people are going to be judged on. So, for instance, if you have a superintendent and they have metrics upon which they're going to be measured by the school committee, are those metrics coming to the school committee from the Department of Ed? Are they coming up with it themselves? How much of what the superintendents at the local level are doing is being judged, being dictated by state mandate? That's one question. The other comment I have is that opting out of the PARCC test is a great thing. However, we can't opt out of the curriculum. So I see that as an even larger problem. I mean, the data mining clearly is an issue, but the opting out of the curriculum is really what I'm worried about, is what are the kids going to be doing each day, and how can we work at the local level, at the state level, where do we work to try and change the drivers that are leading to that curriculum change? If the superintendents are being judged on metrics, I mean, they're all going to be, behavioral science says what motivates you is how you're going to be paid and judged, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course it is.
Yeah.
Of course it is. These are great questions. So let me just start with a clarification. When I was saying before that an opt-out strategy is really important, I was specifically talking about the data collection piece of it. That's so, because this year you were able to opt out, but when PARCC goes live, districts won't be able to opt out. Right? There's no opt-out allowed, and we're only allowed because PARCC is not officially yet adopted as a state because the MCAS is still live. Okay, so
We're in a 2-year test period.
correct.
And the person who is responsible for kind of orchestrating that 2-year test period is Commissioner Mitchell Chester, who is also the chairman of the Board of Governors for PARCC. He's the chairman of the Board of Governors. I assume they made him chairman 3 years in a row because he believes so strongly in it. I would hope that was one of the criteria for their chairman selection. And yet he's the one who's supposed to be objective about whether PARCC is better than MCAS. That wasn't a question, Jim.
Yeah, no,
It's just another one of my rants.
No, I completely agree. He actually became the chair after the Florida chair was fired.
And let me just add one other thing. I probably should have done this at the beginning of the evening. Mitchell Chester was invited to be here tonight to sit and debate with Jim. And as he has done on every other occasion that offer has been made, he ignored it. So
we've gotten him to debate in print. He doesn't like to do it live. So that's probably the best we can get. So let me go right to your question about who made the decisions here first. And then we'll talk a little bit about superintendents and how they're evaluated. And I'd like to talk a little bit about parking just to kind of round out the answer. So who made the decision? The Board of Education made the decision. But you need to know something about the Board of Education. I mentioned that in 1995, Bill Weld and Tom Birmingham and Tom Finneran changed out the Board of Education because they were disappointed with the way that the standards were being developed. At the time, they were pushing things like ebonics and that sort of thing. So that's enough of that. We're going to go for really high quality stuff. When Deval Patrick was elected, one of the things that he pushed for was the ability to truncate the terms of existing board members and to add in new board members. That was granted by the legislature in 2008. There was also the creation of the Secretary of Education role, which is the political appointee. The way that the commissioner's position works, the commissioner doesn't actually report to the governor. He reports to the board. But the governor got control of that by essentially sort of a court packing kind of mechanism, if you will. That's the politicized way of putting it. So they actually adopted Common Core on a unanimous vote. Every single one of them was beholden to the governor for the position. This is something the governor really wanted badly. So those are the folks who made the decision. Now, in terms of, what are the incentives? What's the incentive structure for superintendents? It's going to differ for each and every one. I would say that probably Beverly and Dave could speak better to that here. There's no mandate that comes from the Department of Education that I know of in terms of how you evaluate your superintendents. There are requirements as to what it takes to become a superintendent, that sort of thing.
So just to clarify, it wasn't whether they're a good one or not a good one,
Yep.
but in terms of what kind of curricular, the implementation of Common Core
Yep.
gets woven into sort of the standards for a strategic plan, is that rollout. So is that because they're required by the state to roll out Common Core over a certain amount of time, and so that's what's driving those particular standards?
That's
or is
exactly right. That's exactly right. Because look, I'll give you the example of our superintendent. One of the reasons why we're going after an override to purchase more computers right now is he knows that politically, if he were to be caught behind when PARCC goes live, he's in lots of trouble. So everyone knows that PARCC is coming, right? So what they're doing is they're trying to line everything up as well as they can. And frankly, Massachusetts, I'm going to tell you, this is where like PARCC, don't like PARCC, like this, don't like that. One of the things you should appreciate about Massachusetts, and I have all kinds of quarrels with our education department and our education establishment and everything else. People generally would think that I'm not the friendliest person to teachers' unions and that sort of thing. All that said, we are a cut above in terms of professionalism. When I take a look at some of the other states and how they've rolled this out, take a look at New York State, for example. It is, close to civil war when you have a meeting like this. We're sitting here talking about facts. No, I'm not saying we should pat ourselves on the back. We should get lackadaisical about it. But even when I talk to superintendents and I say, why are you doing this? Why not push back? Et cetera, the answers are fairly good ones, and they go right to what you're saying. This is going to go live. They want to get it done. They plan ahead. They don't wait for the last minute. So that's what's driving it.
But can the superintendents push back on the implementation of Common Core?
They sure can. They sure can.
If they believe that it's the right thing to do.
You're not going to get probably a lot of courage coming from the superintendents per se to push against the content of Common Core. You're going to get it from the school committee members. The superintendents report to that, right? So that's a big policy decision that belongs to school committees.
There is a superintendent of Ludlow who is a very outspoken dissenter, to use the term that we've been given as our label for those who don't go along with Common Core. And but he's a rarity, and I must say, I'm cutting the teachers, the administrators, the superintendents a lot of slack on this issue. I kind of empathize with them, and here's where I come from as a school committee member. It's analogous to this. I might hate the war and do everything in my power to stop the war, but I'm going to support my soldiers. Right now, you know, Common Core is what it is. PARCC is what it is. And I'm not going to tell my superintendent not to dance to that dance and get his people to do the best job they can under these terms. But I'm going to work like heck to change the terms. Superintendents, the average length of time a superintendent stays in a school system, you can appreciate this, folks, as we can in Peabody, less than 3 years. Less than 3 years. So, a superintendent comes in the first year, it's a honeymoon, everything's great. The second year, things are actually required of them, some performance stuff. And the third year, they're out with the resume on the street. And they're not going to get a job. That's just how it works, I'm telling you. It's the reality. And they're not going to get a job if they have a reputation of being a loose cannon. They're just not. So I know for a fact that there are superintendents out here who love this meeting. And really, if they had a chance to give a silent ballot vote, they would vote to just do away with this whole Common Core thing. But they have families to feed, they have careers to pursue, and it takes someone very special in that capacity to speak up against it. It's the reality of it.
I said just a couple more things, and just to build on something Dave said, I want to go back to a comment about PARCC. Yeah, they are livid. If you talk to them quietly, they're unhappy about the way that it's been rolled out by the department, the kind of pressure they're getting to implement it. And this goes also for teachers. You have to understand, when MCAS was given for many, many, many years, every year after the test questions were made public, right? And the reason they did that is what? It's for the craft, the teacher's craft. Teacher sees, oops, in this class, I got the same thing wrong. I better work on that. From a professional development perspective, it's awesome. PARCC has a gag rule in place. They will not let their test questions go live, and teachers cannot let them go live. You're in trouble if you do. Okay? Teachers don't like this at all. And I'll tell you, Massachusetts hasn't caught on as much. It's starting to gain some traction. When you go around the country and you talk to teachers, again, New York State, Indiana, they're livid. And frankly, it's changing the level of support around this. And what I'd say to you is, you should understand, Pioneer, my organization, works primarily on two things. One is lots more school choice, lots more charter schools, lots more Metco if we can get there. Frankly, we'd like to see much more in terms of vocational technical schools, which are schools of choice. They're, in Massachusetts, some of the highest performing vocational technical schools around. So that's one part of what we do. The other part is teacher quality and the quality of the content, right? So what are we doing to try and defeat PARCC? Yes, some of it's here, and I really appreciate the invitation to be here. I do, and I appreciate your interest in staying and asking great questions.
I should add, this is your third such format today.
It is. What I would say is this. We go around the country. I was just in Baton Rouge, just out in Ohio, just in Tennessee. We're trying to get PARCC to the place where enough states pull out of it that is no longer viable. They had 25 participating states before, they now have 16. If they get to a low enough number, they are no longer financially viable because the cost of testing per student goes up. They lose customers, the cost goes up. That's our game. And frankly, it's not the happiest game. I want to work for something positive, but I think in order to get to something positive, we need to undo this. In order to have an opportunity here in Massachusetts to go back at it, we need to defeat it elsewhere because the political alignments right now are such that I don't think anyone's going to go back and look at this. So
we're in overtime now, and I love that because obviously there's high interest. But I want to get Beverly up here. You had a question?
Thanks, David. Thank you, Chair.
My question is about the fact that we are being forced to utilize directed technology on the test and on the evaluations. The whole process is being pushed on us that we have to pull in all this technology. If we don't use it, the comparable system, paper and pencil, is going to put our district at a detriment. I did have a meeting with Commissioner Chester, and at that meeting it was wide-ranging questions about PARCC and Common Core, and one of them was about the fact that we have to use the specific computers, specific computer program, and he spoke about how the test is adaptive. And when that was explained to me about how if you're taking the test on the computer and you get question number 10 correct, you go to a higher level question. I get it wrong, I go to a different level question. My immediate question to him was, what about the people who are using paper and pencil? How can you compare those scores? And he said, there's no problem. Common sense would tell me there's a problem. And the biggest issue that I see is that the more urban, less fully funded school systems are going to be at a deficit already because we're not going to have a computer for every student. We'll use the paper and pencil, and we will already be prejudged just on the basis of those test scores. I don't know how it's going to work with evaluations. I do know in our district we had to go out and get the tablets.
Oh, the iPads?
iPads, to do the evaluations. I'll be honest, it was money we needed for textbooks. And I'm just wondering, going down the road, if you can give us any advice as far as, will there be any type of change in that attitude? Or is everything going to be driven to the point where not only do we have students on a computer, and we have, and I'm not going to say teachers, we're going to have people with an iPad evaluating, we're going to have people learning on these computers and end up cutting our teaching staff because we'll be using canned lessons on the internet. Everyone warns us that in a few more years we're going to see the full effect of the Common Core philosophy. Is that part of it that we're not hearing about yet?
That's a great question, and I just answered with the following, and it's going to be a little bit snippy, so forgive me. We all care about real estate values, right? And so what's the value of your real estate value? To you, it's your biggest investment. And I think that folks who have been advancing this whole idea we have to put things on computers, who often they have a self-interest in it. This is sort of the new Computer Purchase Act, if you will. You're going to have to do it on a constant basis. You're going to have to renew it, and your time for renewing your computers is going to have to go down because there are going to be new things introduced over time. We're down to a 4-year replacement schedule where I live, and I'm going to guess that most everyone's going to have to get to that place in order to make sure that as kids use PARCC and use adaptive tests and all of us going to do that. You know, it's kind of sad. There are lots of upside to technology, huge upsides in some regards, but learning remains a solitary effort in some regards. Some of it's, you can collaborate, and we love hearing about collaborations in the classroom, but a lot of it is, do you have the patience to sit with a book and plow through the book? Do you have the patience to actually work through a math problem on yourself? Do you have the grit to do that? That's sort of a new term that everyone likes to talk about. It's true, though. That's actually true. So your worries about being at a disadvantage with paper and pencil are absolutely real. This is why most superintendents are trying to move forward either overrides or get some access to new funding to drive technology purchases. No one wants to be in that position. Where guess what? The superintendent didn't get it done, and therefore your kids didn't do as well as they could have, and therefore people look at your community as not having a good school system. That's the box we just put ourselves in.
Pearson Testing, who was doing the PARCC testing, entered into, I think about 2 months ago, entered into an agreement with Microsoft to basically develop the hardware and the software for the Common Core curriculum. Just ironically, that's Bill and Melinda Gates, and again, they do a lot of good stuff with their money. They really do. They really helped the world almost eradicate polio, and good luck to him. But at heart, he's an entrepreneur and a businessman, and he stands to make back all the hundreds of millions he spent on Common Core in about 1 year, and it's renewable every year after that. Well, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but thank you for your time, Jim. You've been very gracious, and the information has been spectacular. I hope you leave here, quite frankly, with many more questions than you started out when you walked in that door. Because as much as we've covered tonight, Jim, there's so much more to know, and the new information is evolving every day. Folks, I clearly am against Common Core. I think it's bad for government. I think it's bad for public schools. I think it's bad for the kids and the future of our country. But go out there and make your own determination. Go out there, learn about it. One thing's for sure, as I said earlier tonight, it's going to change public schools forever. And if that's going to happen, we ought to at least know what we're getting ourselves into. If there are no other questions, one question from the back of the room, by all means.
I'm not going to come up here. I didn't.
All right, let's get it. Hey, we'll bring the mountain to Mohammed.
I'll speak loud enough. And I think you hit on a couple of good points. And you said about walking out of here. I'm from Stergios School Committee. And conversation that we've had in our school committee concerning the park has probably been about 5 minutes. Conversation we've had about Common Core has probably been less than 5 minutes. And our administrators, our superintendent, I value their position, but this has to be a situation that's involved the school committee, because we represent the community. And we represent the best aspects of the kids' education. And when people drink the Kool-Aid and don't question and just go about it, congratulations to your school committee for the positions you've taken. When we were sold on the race to the top, we were told what a wonderful operation it was. We didn't question enough, and we weren't provided the information to make an honest decision, and our decision might have been different. So, I mean, there's just a philosophical thing that we as school committees represent our community. And I'm not blaming the superintendents, but they have their livelihoods to protect, but they need to communicate to us, and we have to have the discussion, is this good for our kids? Is this good for Stergios? And then we go from there to the legislature, and that's where we need the legislature to step in and listen to us. Local control is where it's at for our kids in our schools. And the other thing is, I was going to ask a question, and I think you answered it. Why is, in this number one, who developed Common Core standards, all of these groups were funded by a private organization, Bill and Melinda Gates? And my question is, why? There's got to be a reason for them why they're funding it, and I think you just answered it. And the other thing I thought too, in answer to your question, I understood that if you have to do a paper and pencil park test, the district has to pay for that paper and pencil test, which is incredible that we have to pay out of limited funds. Unfunded mandates is another thing that can have a discussion with the legislature too. But that's an absurd situation that the school district, whose funds are meager to say the least, and to spend money on technology, have to pay for the paper and pencil test. Just the. Can I have I wish there was some way that we could get you or somebody from your organization to come to each and every school department and committee meeting to do this, so that we as a community will have some basis, so we know what we're talking about.
We'd be pleased to try. So if there's a time we could do it, we'd be very pleased to do it. We make a real effort. I've got a number of different people who can come and speak, and Sandy Stotsky's one of them, that sort of thing. So if I could just leave you guys with one thing, I told you to leave with something pretty hopeful. And that is, if you asked me about a year ago where we were with Common Core, I would have said, we're probably kind of dead in the water. You just had Indiana pull out of Common Core. Oklahoma is likely to do so. Missouri is likely to do so after that. It is very likely that PARCC runs into additional problems. We are part of PARCC. It gives us an opportunity to actually go back at that question. So that's one thing I'd say that's hopeful. This is not a done question. The second thing is, it's why I appreciate your putting this together, Dave, I really appreciate you doing it, is the bad news is that there's a real backlash against testing out there. It's live, people feel it, even in places like Texas. I was in Texas recently, there were huge sort of outcries against testing. Part of that's reasonable, because we are spending, especially PARCC, is even more time. Definitely, given the chance, we could do it even better. So anyways, thank you very much.
Jim, I think we have just proven the fact that if you get applause in the beginning, you don't get applause at the end as wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, one more hand for Jim Stergios. Thank you so much. And thank you all for being here this evening.